morning. Thank you for joining me today. Today we're going to be in 2 Samuel, chapter 19, verses 11 through chapter 20, verse 13. Then King David sent a message to Zadok and Abiathar the priests, saying, "Tell the elders of Judah, why should you delay any further in bringing the king back to his palace, when everything Israel is saying has come to the king's attention? You are my brothers, my very own flesh and blood. Why should you delay any further in bringing the king back? Say to Amasa, are you not my flesh and blood? God will punish me severely, if from this time on you are not the commander of my army, in place of Joab." He won over the hearts of all the men of Judah, as though they were one man. Then they sent word to the king, saying, "Return, you and all your servants as well." So the king returned and came to the Jordan River. Now the people of Judah had come to Gilgal to meet the king and to help him cross the Jordan. Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjaminite from Bahurim, came down quickly with the men of Judah to meet King David. There were 1,000 men from Benjamin with him, along with Ziba, the servant of Saul's household, and with him his 15 sons and 20 servants. They hurriedly crossed the Jordan within sight of the king. They crossed at the ford in order to help the king's household cross, and to do whatever he thought appropriate. Now after he had crossed the Jordan, Shimei, son of Gera, threw himself down before the king. He said to the king, "Don't think badly of me, my lord, and don't recall the sin of your servant on the day when you, my lord the king, left Jerusalem. Please don't call it to mind, for I, your servant, know that I have sinned, and I have come today as the first of all the house of Joseph to come down to meet my lord the king." Abishai, son of Zeruiah, replied, "For this should not Shimei be put to death? After all, he had cursed the Lord's anointed." But David said, "What do we have in common, you sons of Zeruiah? You are like my enemy today. Should anyone be put to death in Israel today? Don't you realize that today I am king over Israel?" The king said to Shimei, "You won't die." The king vowed an oath concerning this. Now Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, came down to meet the king. From the day the king had left until the day he safely returned, Mephibosheth had not cared for his feet, nor trimmed his mustache, nor washed his clothes. When he came from Jerusalem to meet the king asked him, "Why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth?" He replied, "My lord the king, my servant deceived me. I said, 'Let me get my donkey saddled so that I can ride on it and go with the king, for I am lame.' But my servant has slandered me to my lord the king. But my lord the king is like an angel of God. Do whatever seems appropriate to you." After all, there was no one in the entire house of my grandfather who did not deserve death from my lord the king. But instead, you allowed me to eat at your own table. What further claim do I have to ask the king for anything?" Then the king replied to him, "Why should you continue speaking like this? You and Ziba will inherit the field together." Mephibosheth said to the king, "Let him have the whole thing. My lord the king has returned safely to his house." Now when Barzillai the Gileadite had come down from Rogelim, he crossed the Jordan with the king, so he could send him on his way from there. But Barzillai was very old, 80 years old in fact, and he had taken care of the king when he stayed in Mahanaim, for he was a very rich man. So the king said to Barzillai, "Cross over with me, and I will take care of you, while you are with me in Jerusalem." Barzillai replied to the king, "How many days do I have left to my life that I should go up with the king to Jerusalem? I am presently 80 years old. Am I able to discern good and bad? Can I taste what I eat and drink? Am I still able to hear the voices of male and female singers? Why should I continue to be a burden to my lord the king? I will cross the Jordan with the king and go a short distance. Why should the king reward me in this way? Let me return so that I may die in my own city, near the grave of my father and my mother. But look, here is your servant Kimham. Let him cross over with my lord the king. Do for him whatever seems appropriate to you." The king replied, "Kimham will cross over with me, and I will do for him whatever I deem appropriate, and whatever you choose I will do for you." So all the people crossed the Jordan, as did the king. After the king had kissed him and blessed him, Barzillai returned to his home. When the king crossed over to Gilgal, Kimham crossed over with him. Now all the soldiers of Judah, along with half of the soldiers of Israel, had helped the king cross over. Then all the men of Israel began coming to the king. They asked the king, Why did our brothers, the men of Judah, sneak the king away and help the king and his household cross the Jordan, and not only him, but all of David's men as well? All the men of Judah replied to the men of Israel, because the king is our close relative. Why are you so upset about this? Have we eaten at the king's expense? Or have we misappropriated anything for our own use? The men of Israel replied to the men of Judah, We have 10 shares in the king, and we have a greater claim on David than you do. Why do you want to curse us? Weren't we first to suggest bringing back our king? But the comments of the men of Judah were more severe than those of the men of Israel. Now, a wicked man named Sheba, son of Bichri, a Benjaminite, happened to be there. He blew the trumpet and said, We have no share in David. We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man go home, O Israel. So all the men of Israel deserted David and followed Sheba, son of Bichri. But the men of Judah stuck by their king all the way from the Jordan River to Jerusalem. Then David went to his palace in Jerusalem. The king took the 10 concubines he had left to care for the palace and placed them under confinement. Though he provided for their needs, he did not have sexual relations with them. They remained in confinement until the day they died, living out the rest of their lives as widows. Then the king said to Amasa, Call the men of Judah together for me in 3 days. You be present there with them too. So Amasa went out to call Judah together, but in doing so, he took longer than the time that the king had allotted him. Then David said to Abishai, Now Sheba, son of Bichri, will cause greater disaster for us than Absalom did. Take your lord's servants and pursue him. Otherwise, he will secure fortified cities for himself and get away from us. So Joab's men, accompanied by the Kerethites, the Pelethites, and all the warriors, left Jerusalem to pursue Sheba, son of Bichri. When they were near the big rock that is in Gibeon, Amasa came to them. Now Joab was dressed in military attire and had a dagger in his sheath belted to his waist. When he advanced, it fell out. Joab said to Amasa, How are you, my brother? With his right hand, Joab took hold of Amasa's beard, as if to greet him with a kiss. Amasa did not protect himself from the knife in Joab's other hand, and Joab stabbed him in the abdomen, causing Amasa's intestines to spill out on the ground. There was no need to stab him again. The first blow was fatal. Then Joab and his brother Abishai pursued Sheba, son of Bichri. One of Joab's soldiers who stood over Amasa said, Whoever is for Joab, and whoever is for David, follow Joab. Amasa was squirming in his own blood in the middle of the path, and this man had noticed that all the soldiers stopped. Having noticed that everyone who came across Amasa stopped, the man pulled him away from the path and into the field, and threw a garment over him. Once he had removed Amasa from the path, everyone followed Joab to pursue Sheba, son of Bichri. Ugh. Uh-oh. So, it's kind of a difficult story to follow because of all the names that are present in it. But it's such a mess. So, to recap, Absalom thought himself king, and so he set himself up as king over all of Israel. But Judah, one of the tribes of Israel, stayed loyal to David and helped him cross the Jordan to get away. There was a battle between David's men and Absalom's men. David came out triumphant, and Joab ended up killing Absalom. So the rest of Israel is now without a king, and they're all wondering what to do. And so David uses his pull with the priests to tell the rest of Israel to bring the king back. And so they do. And as he's coming back over the Jordan, Shimei, who was the one who was cursing at David and throwing stones at him, and David said, "Oh, don't kill him. Maybe God told Shimei to curse David." And like what he comes back and apologizes for what he did. And the king swears an oath not to put him to death. But at the end of his life, when Solomon ends up being king, he's like, go punish him. He needed something done to him at this point. Yeah. Okay, also Amasa was the general in charge of Israel's army, that is, Absalom's commander. And as a ploy to get all of Israel to follow David, he's like, okay, instead of Joab, this bloodthirsty man who ended up just killing my son, I'm going to put Amasa in command as kind of like a goodwill token to the house of Israel. And so all of Israel comes and follows David. Also, Mephibosheth apologizes to David and says that the servant who was put in charge of Saul's stuff essentially slandered him by saying that Mephibosheth wanted to be king. So, and this man who helped and cared for David's needs while they were in the desert, Barzillai, the Gileadite, stays on the other side of the Jordan because he's so old, but he sends a servant or a son with David named Kimham. And when Israel ends up following David, they they get into the spat with the men of Judah, who are like, they say, why did our brothers, the men of Judah, in verse 41, sneak the king away and help the king and his household cross the Jordan, and not only him, but all of David's men as well? So they're arguing now. And so Judah counters with, he's our close relative. And they counter with, but we have 10 shares of David. You only have 1 share. And yeah, it eventually ends up causing this so stark a division that Sheba, another seditionist, sounds the trumpet and leads the men of Israel away. So it's like they're having this spat over who loves David more, and then they follow the seditionist away. Yeah. So David sends out his new commander, Amasa. Okay, call everybody together. We need to go address this problem. Call the army together. We need to go address this problem. So Amasa goes out and tries to call everybody together, but he takes longer than the king appointed for him. And so he turns to Joab again, and he's like, go deal with this problem. And Joab goes out and summons some soldiers to deal with the problem. And in the process, he ends up killing Amasa, the new commander of the army. So can't get rid of him as commander of the army if the other commander is dead. So yeah. So David's penchant for not punishing people rears its ugly head in the form of Joab killing this guy again. Killing another attempt to replace him as commander. Okay, John 21, verses 1 through 25. After this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. Now, this is how he did so. Simon Peter, Thomas, called Didymus, Nathanael, who was from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples of his were together. Simon Peter told them, I'm going fishing. We will go with you, they replied. They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. When it was already very early morning, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. So Jesus said to them, "Children, you don't have any fish, do you?" They replied, "No." He told them, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they threw the net, but were not able to pull it in because of the large number of fish. And then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." So Simon Peter, when he heard that it was the Lord, tucked in his outer garment, for he had nothing on underneath it, and plunged into the sea. Meanwhile, the other disciples came with the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from land, only about 100 yards. When they got out on the beach, they saw a charcoal fire ready, with a fish placed on it, and bread. Jesus said, "Bring some of the fish you have just now caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and pulled the net to shore. It was full of large fish, 153, but although there were so many, the net was not torn. "Come have breakfast," Jesus said, but none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus was revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. Then, when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these two?" He replied, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." Jesus told him, "Feed my lambs." Jesus said a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He replied, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." Jesus told him, "Shepherd my sheep." Jesus said a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was distressed that Jesus asked him a third time, "Do you love me?" and said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus replied, "Feed my sheep. I tell you the solemn truth. When you were young, you tied your clothes around you and went wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and others will tie you up and bring you where you do not want to go." Now Jesus said this to indicate clearly by what kind of death Peter was going to glorify God. After he said this, Jesus told Peter, "Follow me." Peter turned around and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. This was the disciple who had leaned back against Jesus' chest at the meal and asked, "Lord, who is the one who is going to betray you?" So when Peter saw him, he asked Jesus, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus replied, "If I want him to live until I come back, what concern is that of yours? You follow me." So the saying circulated among the brothers and sisters that this disciple was not going to die. But Jesus did not say to him that he was not going to die, but rather, "If I want him to live until I come back, what concern is that of yours?" This is the disciple who testifies about these things and has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. There are many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. Yeah. So Jesus appears in front of the disciples again, and even though they saw Jesus prior to this several times, 2 times before, they were still not actively doing anything about it. Yeah, they were out back. They got their old jobs back and were doing their jobs essentially. But Jesus, questioning Peter, says, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And after each of those questions, he replies, "Feed my lambs, shepherd my sheep, feed my sheep." That's Jesus is calling him to a higher calling than just resuming the fisherman career. He needs to tell people what he's seen. So, yeah, and then there's this saying regarding John, "If I want him to live until I come back, what concern is that of yours?" which apparently was misunderstood by people. But yeah, I really like the ending here with verse 25. There are many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. So we don't have a comprehensive record of what Jesus did. But as it was written before, these things were written down so that we might believe and have life in Jesus. So, carrying on, Psalm chapter 120, verses 1 through 7. In my distress I cried out to the Lord, and he answered me. I said, O Lord, rescue me from those who lie with their lips and those who deceive with their tongue. How will he severely punish you, you deceptive talker? Here's how, with the sharp arrows of warriors, with arrowheads forged over the hot coals. How miserable I am, for I have lived temporarily in Meshech. I have resided among the tents of Kedar. For too long, I've had to reside with those who hate peace. I am committed to peace, but when I speak, they want to make war. And finally, Proverbs 16, verses 16 and 17. How much better it is to acquire wisdom than gold, to acquire understanding is more desirable than silver. The highway of the upright is to turn away from evil. The one who guards his way safeguards his life. Yeah. Pretty cool. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. Hope you have a great day. Bye.